In 1947, 20th Century Fox released the now classic film noir Nightmare Alley. The story revolves around roustabout Stan Carlisle, played by Tyrone Power, who joins a traveling carnival and unsuccessfully schemes to figure out the mind-reading act of Mademoiselle Zena and her alcoholic husband Pete, played by Joan Blondell and Ian Keith. But when Pete dies, Zena is forced to take on Stan as a partner, and he quickly proves more gifted than his predecessor. Ambitious to a fault, Stan abandons Zena and the carnival to reinvent himself as the Great Stanton, and along with his young wife and fellow carny Molly, begins wowing high-class audiences in a Chicago hotel, where he captures the attention of the unscrupulous psychoanalyst Lilith. Lilith is in the habit of recording her patients during their sessions, and she shares this information with Stan so he can convince them of his gift and swindle them for large sums of money. Things go sideways when a planned con of the wealthy Ezra Grindle falls apart and Lilith pulls a double cross. Stan must flee, and he finds himself alone, drunk, and at the bottom of the barrel, ready to take up the role of a carnival geek. This bleak and uncompromising tale of con artists, swindlers, carnies, and drunks was right at home in the noir-heavy late 1940s. Based on the best-selling novel by William Lindsay Gresham. The film was something of an outlier, even in a motion picture landscape heavy with noir shadows and smoke. It was a film Fox studio chief Darryl F. Zanuck really didn't want to make. One its star, matinee idol Tyrone Power, pushed, prodded, and willed his way into, and a film that, when it finally made it to the big screen, would not achieve any measure of wide acclaim for another 60 years. Intertwined with all of that is the story of the classic Hollywood star machine that fed its box office darlings to the masses with little regard for their artistic desires, the post-war disillusionment many stars felt with that system, and the story of the film's star, Tyrone Power. From 1937 to 1958, Power was one of the most popular film stars in the world. Devastatingly handsome, genuinely talented, and by all accounts an all-around nice guy. He is well known to any classic film buff, but outside of old Hollywood fans, his films and name recognition pale in comparison to, say, Cary Grant, Humphrey Bogart, and Clark Gable. But to explain how Tyrone Power, who spent the late 1930s and early 40s making light romantic comedies with Sonja Henie and Loretta Young, immensely popular swashbuckling action adventures like The Mark of Zorro and The Black Swan, and historical dramas that called on him to wear a lot of tight-fitting pants. And when I say a lot, I mean a lot. Came to see himself as Nightmare Alley's dark, depraved confidence man, Stan Carlisle. We have to go back.
Hollywood columnist Ed Sullivan presents movie crowns to 20th Century Fox star Tyrone Power and to Jeanette MacDonald.
20 million readers of the Chicago Tribune News Syndicate have selected as their 1939 movie King and Queen, Tyrone Power and Jeanette MacDonald.
In 1939, MGM musical star Jeanette MacDonald and Tyrone Power were crowned the Queen and King of the box office. The poll, conducted by motion picture exhibitors, served to highlight the meteoric rise to fame of 25-year-old Power, and it was a title he would hold for 3 consecutive years. Power was one in the long line of Tyrone Powers who had graced the stages of the United States, England, and Ireland dating back to the 17th century. His father was billed during his lifetime as Tyrone Power and was a well-respected stage actor who'd appeared in silent films and early talking pictures. Our Tyrone rocketed to fame in the 1936 historical drama Lloyds of London. Prior to that film, he'd played smaller supporting roles, but in 1936, he became an actual overnight sensation. The thing about Tyrone Power, much like Errol Flynn and Clark Gable, was he appealed to men and women. He was beautiful but masculine, and his deep, sensuous voice projected strength and maturity.
I don't know. It may be that when I'm through, I will have found something to give that people will be glad to take.
He could fence, ride, dance, and wore clothes beautifully. And all of this played into the creation of his image, which was being shaped and directed by 20th Century Fox's head of production, Darryl F. Zanuck. And prior to the war, this was a fruitful and lucrative arrangement, one that Power didn't balk at too much. Even though he was served to audiences as something to look at, an object of desire, he was young and an up-and-comer. He was willing, at this point, to put his career trajectory in the hands of the studio, which knew how to shape and sell stars. But of course, this came with a price, that price being that commercial success outweighed the importance of his artistic desires. He would eventually be Fox's top male box office star. And in those early films, Fox packaged him as the romantic, rich, and royal type, in light comedies like Café Metropole and Second Fiddle, and eventually costume and historical dramas like Jesse James, where his characters began to have an underlying repressed, sexualized danger. Between 1936, the year of his breakthrough, and 1943, when his last film, made before his war service, Crash Dive, was released, he made 25 movies, graced the covers of film magazines, was crowned King of Hollywood, and had as many romances dissected and discussed in the gossip columns. His films of this period were profitable and popular, but a lot of them were ultimately forgettable. That's not to say his performances were bad. They weren't. He was talented, and he could rise above even the most mediocre assignments, like 1940's Johnny Apollo, which had him playing a rich college kid who turns to a life of crime after his father is imprisoned for embezzlement. There's nothing really special about the film, except that Power looks stunningly handsome, and by 1940, Fox had perfected its Tyrone Power formula, which was to neutralize his seeming perfection with some underlying shadiness. In this case, he's a criminal. In Jesse James, he's an outlaw. In Blood and Sand, he becomes an egotistical, pompous ass. But in all of these movies, his directors film him looking gorgeous. Even opposite his most beautiful co-stars, he's the object of desire. He's the one that gets the most beautiful close-ups. In this period, he had a handful of genuine classics, Blood and Sand and The Mark of Zorro, but he even admitted later while looking back on his career, "I've done an awful lot of stuff that's a monument to public patience." But what's more remarkable are the films that he wasn't able to make, films produced at other studios that would have required Fox to loan him out. Power had left his home studio once in 1937 to go to MGM to make the big-budget historical epic Marie Antoinette, starring the Queen of MGM, Norma Shearer. Marie Antoinette is not a Tyrone Power picture, it's a Norma Shearer picture. Power doesn't even appear until deep into the film's 2-hour and 30-minute runtime. And Zanuck was not impressed with the way MGM used his top star. And while the film was a box office hit, its astronomical production cost assured that it lost money. So when other producers and studios came to Zanuck asking to borrow Power for whatever picture, Zanuck gave them a firm no. Harry Cohn at Columbia wanted him for the part of Joe Bonaparte, the violin-playing boxer opposite Barbara Stanwyck in the screen adaptation of Clifford Odets' massive Broadway hit Golden Boy. That film role eventually went to William Holden. David O. Selznick wanted him for Ashley Wilkes in Gone with the Wind, but Zanuck refused. No shade on Leslie Howard, but Ty as Ashley Wilkes gives us an entirely different movie. There's no questioning why Scarlett couldn't let that go. And over at Warner Brothers, Jack Warner wanted him for the role of Paris Mitchell in King's Row. Sidebar, I have an entire video about King's Row. Despite its flaws, it's one of my favorite films, and one of those flaws is its star, Robert Cummings. He plays the lead role of Paris, and he's the film's weakest link. Had Jack Warner been able to get Zanuck to agree to cast Tyrone Power in the role, it would have elevated an already prestige picture. Power's depth as a performer and his superior acting ability, especially when compared to Robert Cummings, would have served the multi-layered character of Paris far better than Cummings' often awkward performance. And it would have also given Power something that he so desperately wanted at this time, a challenging, complex role in an adult picture. He would later say, You go to the same studio every morning. You get the same kind of part. The costume will be different and the leading lady different, but you find it harder to get much more of a change than that. Power's artistic and personal frustrations really began to bubble in 1939. He was beginning to accept the reality that his talent was being reduced to a sellable, reliable type.
Go away someplace before I ruin your life as well as my own.
No, it's you and me. Out of everybody in the world, us.
And Fox had succeeded in packaging him all too well into a mold that he was beginning to tire of. And he had fallen in love with the actress Annabella, his co-star in Suez, which is a weird historical drama about the building of the Suez Canal, and the New York Times called it one of the most inane of all historical films ever. And that's really all you need to know. When Power announced his intention to marry Annabella, the studio was vocal in its opposition, and the disillusion began to set in. Power had always been faithful to Fox, doing whatever Zanuck had asked of him. But to the studio, he was a dream boy, and as an object of romantic desire, his marriage to the very French, very publicity-averse Annabella was not something his studio saw as a smart move, and Zanuck was not shy in telling him so. But Power defied Zanuck, and he and Annabella wed on July 14th, 1939. And the fan mail poured in, most of it finding Power's new marital status unacceptable. This sent the Fox publicity department into overtime, reworking his image and feeding stories to the fan magazines about how his leading ladies still found him attractive, even though he was married. This is some crazy stuff, guys, and this is not exclusive to Tyrone Power. This is the system at work. And all of our favorite stars from the era who were under long-term contract with one of the major studios were subjected to this at varying levels of intensity. For Power, it really was an untenable situation. He began telling interviewers he would like to return to the stage. He'd come to Hollywood by way of acting on Broadway with stage legend Katharine Cornell, and he was longing for a return to New York. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and the United States entered the Second World War. Power enlisted in the Marine Corps as a private in 1942, and his last film for the duration was the submarine love triangle drama Crash Dive, released in 1943. Power was an experienced pilot, but the Marine Corps considered him over the age limit for active combat flying, so he volunteered for piloting cargo planes that he felt would get him into active combat zones. He flew missions carrying cargo and wounded Marines out during the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. His war service crystallized his desire to make a more meaningful life for himself emotionally and artistically when he returned to civilian life. Luckily for him, his first project back was the role of Larry Darrell in Fox's adaptation of Somerset Maugham's The Razor's Edge, directed by Edmund Goulding and co-starring Gene Tierney, Ann Baxter, Clifton Webb, Herbert Marshall, and John Payne, a talented actor in his own right who was being used by Fox, along with others like Cornell Wilde, to take the place of Tyrone Power while he was away during the war. The Razor's Edge tells the story of Larry Darrell, an American pilot traumatized by his experiences in World War I, who sets off in search of some transcendent meaning in his life. The story begins through the eyes of Larry's friends and acquaintances as they witness his personality change after the war, his rejection of the conventional life and the material world, and his search for a more meaningful experience. This all allows him to thrive, while the more materialistic characters suffer reversals of fortune. And it was the type of role he'd been waiting for, an adult film that dealt with serious themes and complex characters. Power hoped this would be the beginning of a new trajectory in his career. Ann Baxter, his co-star in 2 other films besides The Razor's Edge, said in her biography that Tyrone was Larry Darrell, which is very telling and an insight into Power's post-war personality. But Power, in essence, had been tricked by Zanuck. While Power thought The Razor's Edge marked a shift in the material he would be given, and going forward that post-war Tyrone Power films would be more meaty and adult and have complex characters, Zanuck had no intention of letting that happen. His next film was The Captain of Castile, the perfect, typical Tyrone Power picture, filmed in Technicolor and a return to the swashbuckling adventure fare that he had long grown tired of. But, as fate would have it, the decision to film Castile in Technicolor would delay the film's release. A post-war shortage of film stock with which to make the color prints meant that Castile's release would be held up, and, as a result, Zanuck wanted a quick power film to keep the audience primed. And that brings us to Nightmare Alley. How Tyrone Power ended up in the role of Stan Carlisle is a little murky and varies from source to source. In The Star Machine, Janine Basinger says Power talked Zanuck into buying him the film rights to Gresham's book. However, in Tyrone Power, The Last Idol, Fred Giles says that Fox owned the property and George Jessel was going to produce it with Mark Stevens and Ann Baxter starring. Power personally went to Jessel and asked to be cast as Stan. One fact, however, is indisputable. Once Tyrone Power expressed an interest in the role, Zanuck grew weary of the project. This was not a Tyrone Power picture. It was meant to be a film with a modest budget and didn't warrant a major star. But Power was adamant. This story offered him a chance to capital A act. And once his name was attached, that meant an increase in the budget, a top-level director, and an A-class production. So who is Stanton Carlisle? Why was Tyrone Power so desperate to play him, and what about him threatened the carefully constructed image Zanuck and Fox had created and packaged Tyrone Power in? Stan Carlisle is clever and ambitious and not without a useful streak of ruthlessness. He's a charlatan, an opportunist, a liar, and a con artist. And while his early intentions in the film are never to explicitly do harm, he's not above exploiting a situation in which someone has been hurt. He's a good-looking guy, he knows it, and he knows the effect of those looks on others and uses it to his advantage. He's also a character that, as the film goes on, sinks lower and lower into depravity. While a few of Power's characters featured less than heroic men and hinted at darker dimensions, like his role as the army deserter Clive Briggs in 1942's This Above All, Stan Carlisle's darker dimensions are on full display.
I wonder why I'm like that.
Like what?
I'm never thinking about anybody, except myself.
Did your folks drop you on your head or something?
Yeah, they dropped me all right.
He's not a good guy, but for a lot of the film, he's also not an explicitly bad one either. But he actively makes terrible choices, and the resulting outcomes drive him deeper and deeper into degradation. He's not fated for that life. In fact, he's warned over and over again, first by Xena, to be careful.
You're making a mistake.
Who?
You. If you make the change in the work you're thinking of.
She reads a dark fate in his cards and tells him he needs to watch himself. And he's warned by his young wife, Molly.
Well, you're going against God. Everything you say and do is so true and wonderful, and you make it sound so sacred and holy, when all the time it's just a gag with you.
But he ignores her, and those choices, among others, are what drive him into the dark final act of the film. Zanuck wholly believed the character of Stanton Carlisle would alienate Power from his fans, but the cost of production would be cheaper than most other Tyrone Power pictures, and it would make Power happy and, most importantly, keep him docile. So Zanuck gave the green light. The screenplay by Jules Furthman worked very hard to walk a fine line between the gritty realism of the original novel and stay acceptable to the censors. In the original script outline, Molly divorces Stan and marries her old carny pal Bruno, and Stan is relegated to the geek pit. This ending closely resembles that of Gresham's novel. In story conferences, Zanuck criticized the outlines as lacking a sympathetic character to root for, the very reason Tyrone Power was attracted to the role in the first place. But Zanuck insisted that Stan's character be given some good traits so that the audience could relate to him. This, of course, made the film's ending more aligned with Power's usual movies, and undermined Power's artistic vision for his character. Zanuck was determined not to undermine the image the studio spent 10 years building. Power's Razor's Edge director Edmund Goulding was assigned to direct Nightmare Alley. The production also included top cameraman Lee Garms, who brought an artful moodiness with his use of light and shadow and fog and moonlight to his work on Nightmare Alley. It's hard to say how much of the film's ultimate failure lies in the fact that audiences indeed weren't ready for Tyrone Power in this type of role, or if the studio's lack of confidence in the film is what ultimately sank it. Fox could have prepared the public for the idea of this new, darker, serious Tyrone Power in a publicity buildup in the fan magazines and newspapers. That was not an uncommon approach. The promotional buildup for The Razor's Edge was pretty heavy. For example, a condensed version of the story appeared in the October 1946 issue of Modern Screen. There were also newspaper advertisements, all culminating in a star-studded New York City premiere in November of 1946. In looking in the archives of the Hollywood fan magazines like Modern Screen and Motion Picture in Hollywood, I didn't see any magazine ads for Nightmare Alley or articles hyping its release. The only mentions were in reviews, which were mostly favorable and complimented Power's performance. When it came to Nightmare Alley, Zanuck put zero promotion behind it. The New York Times review from October 1947 stated, "The screenplay by Jules Furthman retains most of the spirit of the novel, though it has toned down some of the characters, but like the book, the film is productive of its moment of shocks and revulsion. There is, in fact, little on the way of human wickedness that Mr. Power doesn't do. Mr. Power has a juicy role and sinks his teeth into it, performing with considerable versatility and persuasiveness." The fanzine Movieland called the film completely absorbing and went on to say that Nightmare Alley can't be dismissed lightly. Its horror is authentic. It isn't a pleasant picture nor an escapist movie fare, but recommend it to those who like their pictures to be gripping and shocking. But there would be no time for those people who enjoyed their pictures to be gripping and shocking to see the film. It spent about 2 months in theaters before Captain of Castile, finally able to be released, was rushed in to replace it and cleanse the public's palate of Stan Carlisle. Nightmare Alley lost $500,000. But it was the film Tyrone Power was most proud of, the film in which he felt he gave his best screen performance. In 1953, when it was time for Power to renew his contract with Fox, he declined, ending one of Hollywood's longest exclusive relationships. From 1953 until 1958, Power made 19 pictures, and they were all over the place. Some were just not good, like Pony Soldier and 1955's Untamed. Some were okay, like 1949's The Prince of Foxes and 1956's The Eddie Duchin Story. And a few were great. The 1951 Western Rawhide, one of my personal favorites. The Long Gray Line, released in 1955, directed by John Ford, and 1957's Witness for the Prosecution, directed by Billy Wilder. He also went to New York and back to the stage. His career as he entered his mid-40s looked to be headed in the direction of character work on film and serious stage roles. His almost supernatural good looks had with age gained a harder edge and a haggard appearance, something he preferred, saying, "I don't want to become an ageless matinee idol having to keep up my looks, never dare smile in case my face cracks." But on November 15, 1958, in Madrid, Spain, in the midst of a sword-fighting scene with co-star George Sanders, Tyrone Power suffered a massive heart attack. He was pronounced dead at the hospital. The tragic thing about Tyrone Power was that he actually had real talent, and he wanted more of a challenge in his professional career. And had he been less beautiful, he probably would have had a more fulfilled career. His legacy pales in comparison to some of his contemporaries. Although he was crowned King of Hollywood 3 consecutive years, it's Clark Gable who holds that title today. In assessing his own career, of the 48 films he made, he was only really proud of 4: Blood and Sand, Nightmare Alley, Abandoned Ship, and Witness for the Prosecution. These were the films that allowed him to stretch his usually confined skills. Contemporary evaluations of his career recognize that he should be a legend. But by allowing the studio machine to drive most of his career, he could never be anything but a commodity to be sold, and unfortunately for him, Fox never wanted to change the Tyrone Power formula or challenge him or his audience with more diverse or complex roles. "Sure, I know I've been lucky," he said. "What I resent about it is that it was all built on a pretty face." There are 8 million stories in the cinema cities. This has been one. Hey guys, I know this video was a little different from my usual fare, so let me know in the comments if you want to see more like this. You can also reach me on Twitter. The links are also in the description below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.